So this is a clip from the recent trip to Birmingham Festival last November, and it's the flute player Matt Molloy playing with a fiddle player called John Carty, playing the tune which is called Trip to Birmingham, which was written by Josie McDermott.
Welcome to Not Just Theologians, Dominicans and their peculiar pursuits. In their 800-year history, Dominicans have shown a notable fascination for the curious and the bizarre. St. Catherine de' Ricci liked to bake marzipan, St. Margaret of Hungary bred hedgehogs, and St. Albert the Great was enchanted by worms in the garden. The mind of a preacher requires a willingness to seek truth in all things, to see the hand of God at work in the whole of his creation. And so Dominican life has always encouraged a healthy eclecticism, a zeal for the peculiar, a living out of St. Paul's maxim to take every thought captive for Christ. Not Just Theologians is a new series in which we will explore some of the peculiar pursuits and passions of the friars, to see where a mind in pursuit of truth might be led. This week we speak with Father Robert Gay, prior of Blackfriars Oxford and a bioethicist, about Irish folk music and his adventures with his flute.
It is my pleasure to interview Father Robert, who is currently the prior of Blackfriars Oxford. He's got a doctorate in biology and now lectures in moral theology and bioethics. Previously, he lived in Leicester, where he worked in a parish and as a prison chaplain. None of this, however, gives away the fact that Father Robert is also a musician. More specifically, you play the flute, as the friars in this house know very well. So, when did you start playing?
So, my story with the flute comes in two separate phases. There's the phase that was the phase in my childhood, and then a much more recent phase started about 4 or so years ago. So the phase that started my childhood was that when I was in primary school, at about the age of 7, coming up 8, I started classical flute lessons in primary school with a peripatetic teacher, and continued to have those lessons both in school and then later on outside school hours until I was about 17 or 18. It was a period of time when my parents made a lot of efforts to try and get me to practice, and I was always very reluctant to do so, but we did keep going right throughout my school days. But during that time, I really, as part of my parents' attempts to try and encourage me to practice and to be enthusiastic about the flute, they bought several James Galway records. And one of those records was James Galway and the Chieftains. And the Chieftains are a reasonably famous Irish ensemble, have been going since the 60s, really, in various formats, guided by their Ellen Piper, Paddy Maloney. And they did this tour with James Galway. And in that recording there was the playing of probably the best Irish flute player that's ever lived, called Matt Molloy. And Matt Molloy's, I've been fortunate enough to meet him more recently. But it's a very different kind of flute sound, a very different instrument I came to see later, a very different tone, a very different style, a different way of articulation and so on. And I was absolutely captivated by that. And I went to my flute teacher not long afterwards and said that I'd love to play that kind of music. And she said, that's great. Once you make progress with your classical, you'll be able to move on to that. I think it's fair to say that my classical progress was remained at a very stunted level, I would say, by the time I left school. And then later on, really, in my time up in Scotland, when I was a doctoral student before I joined the order, sort of reconnected with Irish and Scottish traditional music and sort of started to develop that interest, which only translated into playing instruments really when I was in the order, much later on, after my ordination, in fact, so coming up 10 years ago. And in my attempts to to learn Irish music, I tried to play pretty much every instrument you can think of in the Irish music repertoire, except the Irish flute, until about 4 or 5 years ago when I finally gave in and got a cheap polymer Irish flute, and realised that some of the things that I'd learnt some 20-something years earlier on were, some of them at least, were transferable, but it sort of sparked an interest to really take the playing seriously, and it's developed since then, I would say. So a two-phase story with the flute, one with the classical flute, a later one with the Irish flute, but very much built on what I learnt, I suppose, when I was a child at school, in terms of the embouchure, in terms of the playing and things like that. So it's the second phase very much built on the foundations of the first. So.
How different would you say is the classical flute to the Irish flute, and did you find the transition from one to the other easy?
I think I'd probably in some ways forgotten as much about the classical flute as I'd learnt, except for things about how to make a sound, the basic positioning of the body and things like that, which are pretty much the same. But the classical flute is a very different instrument, a keyed instrument, fully chromatic, and a very different kind of tone as well, very different shape of the bore of the flute, designed for a particular tone, particular sound, particular stability. The Irish flutes, some of them have keys, but the basics of what you play in Irish music require relatively little or no use of the keys at all. And so mostly you're playing with open holes. It's an open hole simple system, which allows you then to put a different kind of variation in the music. So there's a lot more work with the fingers to create the articulation and the ornaments and things like that than might often be the case with a standard classical flute. So very different instruments in that respect. A very different kind of tone as well. Slightly, slightly breathier tone on the wooden Irish flute, but also sometimes, especially in the lower register, you can really make it bark. That woody structure actually gives substance to the tone and things like that. So it actually sounds substantially different, I would say, to the classical flute.
Between these two phases you have mentioned, first playing the classical flute in your childhood and later starting with the Irish flute, right? You also played a variety of instruments as well. What other instruments did you play and why did you choose these?
I think I chose the instruments that I made attempts to play because I liked the sound of them. I liked how different they were. So I played for a while and still play the button accordion, which I enjoyed very much, and that was something that I bought just after my ordination. Spent some time playing with that. I also spent some time with the Irish bouzouki, which is like an overgrown mandolin for accompanying Irish music, and time with the Irish tenor banjo as well, before coming back to the flute. So a sort of evolution of things, but what I learnt as a child certainly made it much easier eventually to come back to the flute. But a lot of that evolution, I suppose, was influenced by what I was listening to, the breadth of the music and things that I was listening to, the musicians themselves and their stories and what they had to offer that sort of, I suppose, fired my imagination.
So you not only got all these instruments, but also you started to play with other people as well. How did you find the social side of music?
Well, that was something that evolved while I was in Leicester, actually. There's a group, Cultus Ceoltóirí and the Irish Music Association, I suppose, loosely translated, which is very active in Ireland. Almost every parish would have one in Ireland, but there are branches and groups all over the UK as well. And there is a group in Leicester, and so once I was assigned to Leicester, I started going to that group partly to listen and then eventually to play, and that sort of developed my interest and desire to play with other people, I suppose, rather than just trying to learn and practice by myself. Then there was a social context to that, and learning from other musicians, which of course is a really important part of how Irish traditional and Scottish traditional music is passed on. It's not usually passed on by writing down the music and scores, but rather you learn tunes from people who play them and you start to play along and you learn by ear in that way. So I think it really helped me to develop my interest in playing and spurred me on to practice even further. So that was the basis of a lot of my my leisure time in the Priory practicing, but also my leisure time outside the Priory as well. But it also formed part of a different kind of connection with parishioners of our own parish and practicing Catholics from other parishes in Leicester as well, that they were people who were attending the session either to play and to or to listen or to dance in that session that happened in the Emerald Centre every month. And it gave a different kind of connection with Catholics from across the city, often but not always of Irish background, Irish extraction, either first or second or third generation. So that developed a whole new dimension to the music, the social nature, but also as an extension of your interaction with parishioners and with other Catholics and other people besides.
You have been going to a number of festivals as well. Particularly, I know you're very keen on the trip to Birmingham Festival. Can you tell us about these experiences going to?
Okay. Well, there are several reasons to be keen on the trip to Birmingham Festival. First of all, because it's within easy reach of both my previous assignation in Leicester and also here in Oxford, but also because the origins of the festival find their origins in a tune written by a particular flute player that is I'm very fond of, Josie McDermott, who was a Roscommon Sligo border flute player who was completely blind but had a very big influence on the music in that area. And in fact, the festival itself is named after a tune that he wrote called Trip to Birmingham, which is he wrote on a journey from London to Birmingham to play in a particular concert in Birmingham many years ago. So the Trip to Birmingham Festival seeks to honour his memory, and you'll often find that very tune played at the Trip to Birmingham Festival itself. So it's an important festival because in the wintertime when a lot of things are shutting down, there's a little bit of extra music, and it draws, at a quiet period of the time of the year, it draws particularly the best Irish musicians over to play, musicians that otherwise you might have to go to Ireland to see or to listen to. They actually come over, so you have a star-studded lineup of the best of the current musicians who are playing, but it also gives an opportunity for younger musicians who are coming through, those who are graduating from the various traditional music courses in the UK and Ireland, and others. It gives them a chance to start to showcase their music and gives them their first steps into professional musicianship as well. So it has many different facets to it that make it very enjoyable.
And you've also been going to Ireland as well to other events as a result of all these connections that you've been able to make. That's
right, yes. Partly because of my interest in the Irish flute. I've been now three years in a row now to County Mayo in the west of Ireland, to the foot of Croagh Patrick, which has not only given me a chance to be in that very beautiful area, which of course the Mountain Croagh Patrick having a particular religious significance in Ireland, but also it's going to the heart of Connacht flute playing, so it gives a foothold to explore the flute playing counties such as Sligo, Roscommon, Leitrim and Mayo as well. So it gives an opportunity to travel around the landscape that has shaped those tunes and to meet some of the people who play those tunes and so on. So that's been a great experience for me.
And as a Welshman, have you been struck by any particular similarities between Irish culture and Welsh culture or Celtic culture in general?
Yes, so I think the people certainly in the west of Ireland and in the west of Wales are formed by very similar kind of habitats. The juxtaposition of the mountains and the sea, the rain, the wind, the exposure to the elements creates a very similar kind of landscape very often, but also the fact that they are rural agricultural landscapes and rural people living in small towns and villages as well shapes a certain kind of life as well. So I would say that what they have in common is a very strong sense of community. So there is a common friendliness between people in both countries, a desire to stop and to chat about whatever is going on, knowing neighbours and people in the town by name, I think the pace of life is often a little bit slower than it certainly would be in big city England, places like London and Birmingham and so on. There's a very different kind of lifestyle which takes things at a day at a time and at a slower pace. So those are common features that I would think between the two places. So they're features that enrich life dramatically anyway, but also mean that there's an easy exchange between countries and cultures in that regard.
You've also been trying to learn Irish Gaelic.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Have you found that easy?
It's very difficult, actually. It's highlighted how very different both the Irish Gaelic and the Scots Gaelic are from Welsh, despite having a common ancestors in amongst the Celtic languages. You can see that divergence that's happened between, say, Welsh and Breton and Cornish and Scots Gaelic and Irish Gaelic. That difference is very, very significant. There are very few pegs to hang the words on that are familiar. So it's very, very challenging, but starting to develop a sense perhaps of the landscape of that language and the way it works and the way it affects Irish English, I would say as well, has been very, very stimulating, and despite the differences, again, you do see some connections and some common roots to certain things, which is interesting.
How would you say that playing the flute and discovering the social side of it has shaped your life as a Dominican and perhaps even your spiritual life?
Well, I think flute playing has something very important to teach us about our life of prayer and our life with God. If nothing else, you might think of them as transferable skills, because I think the first discipline in music is always to listen. It's to have the ear open. That's not just important, I suppose, with playing with other people, but even when you play on your own, if you want to learn, if you want to improve your tone, your technique, the way that you play a tune, the first thing you have to be able to do is to listen to the way that you play. I suppose even to learn the tune in the first place, that's something that in Irish music is done primarily by listening rather than by reading music or by having sheet music and so on. But also especially playing with other people, the pace, the rhythm and so on, all of those things come by listening carefully to the others that are in the group. And I think when we think about our spiritual lives, it seems to me that although we often think of our life of prayer in terms of petitions, asking God for things and so on, the primary thing about prayer, it seems to me, is our willingness to be open to listen to God. Whatever we may want to present to God ourselves, all that is good, but actually we are truly changed and we're truly refashioned, recreated by God if we're willing not just to give him our lives, but to receive back the life that he wants to give us. So I think music in general fosters that. In my own spiritual life and in my own life as a Dominican, I would say that it's hugely important that my life of prayer also is something which takes place a lot of the time in the context of a community, a sung office, a common office, and the music that I'm interested in is not so much a music which is concerned with solo performance, but rather something that happens when a group of individuals, often a group of friends, get together in an informal setting and actually create something organic in that moment by playing with each other, by listening to each other. And I think our Christian lives are obviously played out in that kind of dynamic, that we seek to build bridges with people, we seek to make friendships with people, with other Christians, and we seek to build bridges with people outside our own faith and so on, but all the time seeking a common life, a common understanding, and a common worship of God. I think so. Those elements, I think, support and enhance my living out of my life of faith, and they are things which also come from my faith, I suppose, and feed into the way that I would understand Irish music and the way in which it's played and performed as well. So there's an interplay between my life of faith and my enjoyment of music in that way.
And was the amount of music that we have in the religious life, the musical side of it, that we sing at the office, for example, a decisive factor in your vocation, would you say?
It certainly was, yes. I mean, growing up in Wales, we did a lot of singing. That's one of the key features of Welsh music is that there's a lot of song really, and a lot of our history, and a lot of our poetry, and a lot of our stories and so on are set to music in that kind of way. So being able to sing has always been a very important part of my life, and to see an order which takes that seriously as we do as Dominicans was very attractive. I couldn't have imagined the life of saying my office entirely on my own all of the time. As Dominicans, there are times when we have to do that, and it's right and proper that it should be so, but there is something very attractive, at least, about singing at the very minimum the major hours, Lauds and Vespers, together in common, in community.
What are your 3 favourite pieces of Irish folk music?
3 favourite pieces of music, I suppose. As I've already suggested, I'm very, very fond of the flute music of the northern part of Connacht. And so I would say that there was a piece that I first heard that really struck me by Matt Malloy, which is called The Parting of Friends, which is a slow air, which is very, very moving, and particularly the way that I would say he plays it. He plays it with particular beauty, and that would be one of my favourite pieces. And I would play that myself and go back to that. It's one of the pieces I'm quite happy to play on my own in front of other people even. And I would say I'm very fond also of the faster music, of the reels. So the Trip to Birmingham would be one of the favourites, but there's a particular set of reels called the Tarbolton set, which comes from the South Sligo musicians, that has the Tarbolton and 2 other reels as part of it. So often Irish music works not just with individual tunes, but with sets of 3s. And that particular set of tunes, the Tarbolton set, would be a favourite of mine. Yes, and in terms of playing, I would say it's always good to play polkas and slides when you've got dancers present. So there are any number of polkas that I would really enjoy playing, which are musically relatively simple to a certain extent, but rhythmically they need to be spot on in order for people to dance to them. So there's a particular joy about playing polkas when you've got people there to dance to those. So there are too many of those to mention, but I'd say there's a great satisfaction in playing those particular tunes for dancing.
Are you working on any particular music at the moment?
I think most of the things that I'm working on are things that I've heard while I'm going about my day-to-day work, or when I'm relaxing. I'm a very enthusiastic collector of tunes, and partly what I'm doing is I'm listening to all kinds of musicians playing tunes, and then looking for things not just that I like, but that I might like to play as well. So there was a very recent set of tunes that was played on as part of a series on the Irish language television channel Tígia Cara, a series about a journey of 2 musicians from Kerry up the west coast of Ireland, all the way through the counties from Kerry up to Donegal, and they stopped in Sligo, and there's a particular set of tunes that a flute and a concertina player play together there in Sligo town that I don't have the name for, but I'm actually trying to learn those by ear and replicate those at the moment. So, but that's the kind of thing that I do all the time. I'm looking for things that I like and that sit well on the flute that I want to learn because I like the tunes themselves. So that's an ongoing project.
Now, if I ask you to play some music for our listeners, would you accept?
What?
That's the way that I think we could probably finish the interview. With a little persuasion, Father Robert agreed to play for us.
So now I'm going to play the tune that gives the Trip to Birmingham Festival its name, Trip to Birmingham by Josie McDermott.